Everyone, we're so thankful to have you here with us tonight as we present the Search Institute Resilience Through Strength survey results with all of you. I'm Sarah Dunlap, and I'm the Director of Council for Youth Development. For those of you less familiar with CYD or what we do, we're a cross-sector coalition that aligns efforts to advance a culture of positive youth development in Bartholomew County. In short, we are an alliance for combined action. We partner with over 100 community organizations to focus on all aspects of youth development. There are many representatives from those organizations with us tonight, and we thank them for the dedicated work they are currently doing and any future work they take on as a result of the information presented tonight. I want to share a few notes about tonight's presentation. This is a 90-minute presentation. There will be time for questions near the end of the presentation this evening. Please share any questions that you have in the chat. They will be answered at the end as time allows. Remaining questions will be answered in a follow-up FAQ document. This presentation is being recorded and will be available along with documents and next step suggestions on the Council for Youth Development website. We are joined tonight by several members of the resilience team, former CYD Director Heather Carson, as well as Dr. Stuart Hart and Justin Roscoff of the Search Institute. Dr. Hart, would you mind sharing a few words?
Thank you, Sarah. Tonight, I have the pleasure of being a representative of the IUPUI School of Education, International School Psychology Association, and International Institute for Child Rights and Development, all of which are strongly interested in and supportive of this initiative. I'm here with you to celebrate Bartholomew County's concern and action to advance the safety, resilience, and well-being of school community children and youth. Thoreau said, "Each child begins the world again." To some extent, a powerful statement. Experts throughout the world have been worrying about what we must do to take seriously this once in a universe occurrence of the added value, the great potential of each new life, each and every child, to protect and promote the great potential of each young life toward thriving and flourishing, which will benefit all persons and all conditions of life. I've had the good fortune to be involved in this adventure with many wonderful colleagues here and around the world. The collective wisdom of these experts has recommended the course you've taken, the primary framework of your initiative. Number one, to identify what is desired as the conditions of safety, resilience, and well-being of children, and what supports it, consistent with your community values. Two, to determine the status of progress toward these purposes. And three, to plan and act to appreciate existing good conditions and to make further advances. A few years ago, a consultation of child development and child rights experts agreed that a central component of the best way forward would be community surveying of the safety, resilience, and well-being of children and youth, and of the conditions promoting and impeding what is desirable. They went on to suggest the Search Institute's history of related work should be applied in cooperation with community leadership to formulate and conduct the survey. You have done that and are a model worthy of consideration throughout Indiana, the United States, and the world. Once in a while, we have the good fortune to be part of a major advance, something sustainable and with expanding benefits, a genuine game changer. This is one of those times. We're here today to celebrate what you have done and to unpack some of what has been learned so that in your next steps, you might make the very most of it in promoting the best quality of life possible for your children and youth. The survey you've applied frames what is and continues to be truly valuable, deserving our individual and collective attention and support. Many communities will be eager to learn from you. As examples, a Notre Dame professor has recently told me of his interest in bringing this initiative to school communities with which he works. And leadership in Ethiopia, has stated its intentions to bring it to their school communities. And this is just the beginning. It is my distinct pleasure to be a part of this work and to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hart. I'm actually going to just jump right in as well. My name is Heather Carson, and I am the former Director for Council for Youth Development. I am so excited to see so many names and faces on here that have actually been a part of this whole process for resiliency for many, many years. And so I'm just going to be sharing kind of the context and the story behind before Search Institute with Justin will be presenting the results for our county level data on youth voice. So I'm going to share my screen. And I think just as a reminder, Sarah had already mentioned that make sure that if you do have a question to put it in the chat box, and we will, if we can't get to it at the end because of time, we'll make sure that that frequently asked question document includes those as well. So I thought I'd just reiterate that. So overall, this journey that Dr. Hart had mentioned is something that had many individuals and many community partners, not only locally, but nationally and internationally that have been a part of things. We actually, even as a group, decided on the name Resilience Through Strengths because we believe in the work that we have been doing with developmental assets and developmental relationships in Bartholomew County, and we're invited to be a part of something really essential as we move forward with our young people in this day and age. So one of the reasons why Bartholomew County was selected was because of the great work we have been doing with Search Institute since 2018. We as a community, actually both BCSC and Flat Rock Hog Creek, had completed the developmental asset profile survey. You've heard Council for Youth Development, others talk about the last couple of years as benchmark data and how our young people are doing, or do they have the supports and strengths that they need in order to thrive and to be successful. And we learned some things from that first developmental asset profile survey in 2018 that was really a call to action. So as you know, in Bartholomew County, we had the youth master plan that we really took initiatives and strategies both in the schools and in the community very seriously and included alongside our youth themselves to find solutions. Part of that then was what were those priorities that we have said is our commitment. So we know that for Bartholomew County and the work that we do, that we pursue and want to continue to pursue a holistic approach to student success, that the work that we do is strengthening school and community partnerships, that we're integrating developmental asset best practices, which we all know many of you have adopted and aligned the work that you do in your own organizations and as individuals. We're modeling developmental relationships, we're measuring student, school, and community growth, and really the priority we have had since the beginning is ensuring all have the opportunity to thrive. That last one is critical because when we started to explore are we truly supporting all young people? We know that some of our young people have had traumatic life experiences that have impacted their developmental growth. And so part of that comes from adverse childhood experience for some where there's trauma and toxic stress in their life. And so ACEs is usually through the research, you would see that when we talk about it tonight, because that's going to be a key part of this project and it's the report out, just keep in mind that ACEs is adverse childhood experiences. There's 3 types of ACE kind of experiences, those around abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction that individuals, children, and adults may experience. The more ACEs, the more experiences that you have, the more likelihood or the more risk that you will have health outcomes that are not healthy for you or for those that have suffered from some of these challenges. The great thing is that what we were looking at is how do we make this connection in terms of those that have struggled? How do we make sure everyone, regardless of perhaps that they've had ACEs or do have ACEs, how do they thrive equally and equitably in our community? So the pilot project, the whole focus that we've had and what we've worked on is, can a community-wide investment in well-being buffer the harmful effects of adverse childhood experiences? And at the heart and the center of this is our Flat Rock, Haw Creek, and BCSE school corporations that have really leaned in to lead a lot of this social emotional well-being focus, and the community has embraced a lot of it. And we know that a heart of that is also those students that are in and out of the school program and the community. So the project overall, if you're thinking about the context or the purpose, the goal, the first one is really about our local commitment, and that is we want to see you out of this project to generate high quality actionable data for schools and community stakeholders so that all young people thrive in Bartholomew County. From Search Institute's perspective, it's really about building evidence of the empirical association between well-being and ACEs, and that includes the developmental assets and developmental relationship frameworks from Search Institute. And really that third piece is what Dr. Hart is talking about, is that with this pilot, that it establishes a proof of concept so that it's not just a great measurement tool and really a call to action and information for Bartholomew County, but this impact ripples out to the state, the nation, and internationally, so that there are more asset builders to help more young people across the world. So we feel pretty excited that we've got to have a small piece of this in our community, and that's because of all the hard work that has already been gone into this work. So while we started in 2018 with that developmental asset profile survey, this development of this survey really started in late 2020, beginning of 2021. We were able to get IRB process, and Justin will kind of identify kind of the validity of this survey as he's doing his presentation. And we'll talk about when it was conducted, and also that tonight, this is kind of our report out for you. Keep in mind that as this is happening, our young people, all of us, have navigated a unique experience since 2018. And that includes public health crisis, but also political and social change that has happened and challenged, and also really provoked all of us to really think about our own well-being. So that is just something we want to be a part of it. So the nitty-gritty of this survey is that 6,206 students completed the survey. In September, it was September 6th through 9th of 2022. The surveys were with BCSE and Flat Rock Haw Creek students, grades 4 through 12. It lasted about 45-50 minutes. It was in the classroom in person. And the reason it was in person was so that there were student support and resources available, so that those young people, as they were answering questions, if anything came up, there were trusted adults that were there to respond to anything they may have. The modules in the survey we're talking about for grades through 4 through 12 had that developmental assets profile survey component so that we can compare to 2018. Then we also had developmental relationships, developmental outcomes, and academic motivation, experience of bias and belonging. And this was really critical, and it'll be interesting tonight when you hear from Justin about effects of COVID-19 on our young people. There were additional questions that were specific to grades 9 through 12, high school students only, around adverse childhood experiences. And there were even some that were more specific to 18 and older, if it was kind of a mature question. So all of this was vetted. There was input from our school administration leaders, as well as experts in the area of child maltreatment and child psychology that was looking at this, and it was reviewed by IUPUI's Department of Education. Finally, the last piece, we took this to heart right from the get-go in terms of how we prepared for this survey. We made sure that we had drafted parent and provided parent consent letters, that there was a survey instruction video that included high school, actually all age students from Flat Rock, Haw Creek, and BCSE, and that could be viewed. We'll make sure that that's available to you. That just basically just was shown at the beginning of the survey to remind young people that the questions were optional. They could opt out at any time, and to be as truthful as possible, and know that this was because the community cared. We wanted to hear from them. So those last kind of pieces, and then finally Family Service Inc. We had mental health providers available during and after the survey in case any young student wanted to have a confidential telephone call with an expert in the area of mental health. So overall, in terms of preparation and considering and thoughtfulness of why we did this, why we were chosen, what is exciting is that we feel we have a better understanding of our own young people locally. So we could look at data from broader statistical information, but this is our own children and adolescents and teens that are sharing with you and me and all of us how they're doing, their perceptions. And for us, we would want to really take it in tonight and see how we can address things and actually maybe do better for them. So with that, I'm going to move this over to Justin, and Justin's going to share the report.
All right, thank you, Heather. That was a great introduction. I think that sets the context nicely for what we're going to talk about with the data, which I view as one of the most exciting things to get to talk about. So my name is Justin Roskoff. I'm with Search Institute, and I manage the survey services at Search. So a lot of my day-to-day is actually focused specifically on data. With this project, I worked with some colleagues as part of the core team, and it's been great to see this evolve and be implemented over the last couple of years. A little bit about Search Institute for those of you who may be unfamiliar. So we're a nonprofit that conducts positive youth development research. We're based out of Minneapolis, but we work beyond those borders, of course. And we collaborate and partner with communities like Bartholomew County to promote positive youth development and advance equity through research and practical solutions. And it's really through these partnerships where we seek to discover what young people need to succeed and how they contribute to their communities and the world around them. We aim to help you understand how to strengthen relationships with young people in your community and building the type of developmental relationships that shape who these young people are and the opportunities they have to learn, grow, and thrive. So for most of the rest of the time today, we're going to unpack what the Resilience Through Strengths survey measured, which, as Heather pointed out, was quite varied, and there's no shortage of data to talk through. And yeah, so I'm going to just start a little bit by going a bit more deeply into the actual survey design before we jump into the results, though. So I think it's important to recognize that there are some strengths and there are some limitations with youth self-report surveys, or really any self-report survey, not just limited to young people. Surveys are a popular mechanism for understanding student experiences because of these strengths that I have listed on this slide. But I think the most important one to acknowledge here is that it gives an avenue for youth voice to be part of the action and part of the process. And we also know that an individual's perceptions matter and are highly predictive of both other subjective and objective outcome measures. We also know that with surveys, it's an opportunity for us to ensure that we're incorporating more voices, or potentially all voices, within the work. Now, some of the limitations to acknowledge are that anytime you're conducting a survey, there's of course going to be scenarios where young people may misinterpret items, may answer them differently than the original intent. There may also be some extraneous factors. For example, maybe they conducted the survey in a room or environment where youth were tired or it was noisy, so there may have been some distraction. There may also be reference bias, meaning that young people are coming or approaching each question from a different referential point. And we also know that occasionally social desirability bias can come into play anytime you're asking a question of someone who's participating in a survey. But given those limitations, they don't outweigh the strengths. And we know that there are ways to mitigate these limitations in our analyses as well. So one way we do that is through our data cleaning processes, looking for patterns when we're analyzing the data, and of course, cleaning or removing those responses before we actually conduct the results. So now we're going to actually turn our attention to the data. And I just want to note that for the purposes of the conversation today, I'm going to focus on a pretty high level. So for the most part, I'm going to look at aggregate data. Where there were notable differences in subgroups, I'll also mention those as well. But for the most part, the data you see on the slides will be in the aggregate. So Heather did a good job of outlining what we're assessing with the survey. So here is the list again. One thing I want to note is that while this survey was developed specifically as a pilot for use in Bartholomew County, many of the measures do come from or are adapted from Search Institute's other measurement tools. So one example would be the developmental assets profile that Heather mentioned was conducted in 2018. That was also incorporated into this survey as well. So we have a pretty strong research base for the measures, for most of these measures, but they were contextualized for the purposes of this pilot. And because of that, there aren't really any comparison data, or at least a one-to-one match comparison data. So it really is a unique data set and a really exciting data set that we're hoping, as Stuart mentioned, we're hoping to deploy in other communities as well. So I always like to start by unpacking who participated in the survey. So we have a sense of what we're looking at when we look at the aggregate data. And so we have a sense of, are there communities or populations of young people that maybe aren't as represented as they should be? And potentially that's an action item after this to make sure their voices are incorporated as well. So overall, we had 6,206 students participate across grades 4 through 12, and there were similar participation levels across those grades. Looking at the population of young people, this represents about 78% of the community. So a fairly good representation overall. Over 3/4 of the young people in grades 4 through 12 were able to participate. Now, we asked some basic demographic questions, 2 of which are listed on this slide. So the first being gender. So generally pretty evenly split between girl and boy at 46% each, and then 8% of the participants self-described. Looking at race ethnicity, we had about just shy of 2/3 state that they're white, and the next 2 groups with the highest representation were Hispanic or Latino, with about 12%, and then young people who selected more than one race at 13%. A couple of other demographic questions. One at the top there is what we refer to as financial strain. So when we talk about financial strain, it's not necessarily income levels, it's the young person's perspectives of their family's ability to purchase what they need or beyond what they need. And those with the most financial strain acknowledge that they struggle to pay for their basic needs, such as food or housing. So with that definition in mind, we had 8% of the participants say that they experience moderate or high financial strain, meaning they do occasionally struggle with basic needs. About 1/3 of the sample said a little bit of financial strain, and 59% said they had no perceived financial strain. And for the sexual orientation question you see at the bottom there, that was limited to high school students. So I just want to note that it only included grades 9 through 12, so a smaller sample size here. But generally, most students, 77% selected straight, 3% gay or lesbian, 10% bisexual, and then 5% used the self-description field, and another 5% chose the prefer not to respond. So Diving into the data, I wanted to start with COVID because, as Heather acknowledged, this was a unique period of time when the survey was conducted. So it was conducted in fall of last year, September, as noted, but there were still lingering effects. I think it was important for us to acknowledge that they went through a pandemic. We know that relationships are impacted because of the pandemic. So we wanted to understand a bit more how young people perceived some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So generally, I just think this is important context before we go into the other measures, which is why I'm starting with COVID. So we asked students during the pandemic, so not necessarily at this precise moment, but during the pandemic, how stressful was it? And 22% of students, so just over a fifth of students, said that the pandemic has been very stressful. And we had a continuum of stress levels that they could select, and overall 86% selected anything from a little stress to very stressful. So most students had some level of stress related to the pandemic. We also asked about the feelings of connection that they had during the pandemic. And 2/3 of students said that during the pandemic, they did not feel as connected to their teachers. When posed the same question now about parenting adults or friends, 20% of students said they didn't feel as connected to their parents, and 42% felt that they weren't as connected to their friends during the pandemic. So now we asked another question about, at this current moment, so in September of 2022, when the survey was conducted, would you say that your relationships are weaker, stronger, or are they pretty much the same as they were prior to the pandemic? And this is what they told us. 15% of students felt that the relationships with teachers are weaker. 20% of students felt that their relationships with teachers are stronger. And the other 65% felt that there really wasn't a change now at this point. We also posed those same questions again for parenting adults and friends, and a little bit of a different response here, but only 8% of students felt that relationships with their parents were weaker, and 41% said that they actually improved, that relationships with their parents were stronger now than prior to the pandemic. With friends, it was similar, 13% weaker and 39% stronger. We also know that parenting adults and teachers served critical roles as mitigators, especially because we saw that stress levels for some students were high. We wanted to better understand what roles did teachers and parents play in mitigating those effects. So 45% of students felt that teachers helped them feel like things are more normal during the pandemic, and 78% said the same of their parents. 43% of students, so a similar percentage, felt that teachers helped them make sense of their feelings, and 73% parents. 52% of students felt that teachers gave them a space to share their feelings and experiences specifically related to the pandemic, and just over 3/4 felt the same about their parents. So there was a key role that was played by adults that surround these young people in helping to mitigate some of the concerns that they highlighted. We also know that they themselves play a role in mitigating the impacts of the pandemic. So we wanted to better understand, how did students cope during this 2+ year period? And what we heard is that 82% of students talked about their feelings related to the pandemic with others. 64% saw this as a learning opportunity, and 79% took it upon themselves to problem solve any related issues. 51% of students really struggled and found it hard to think about anything other than the pandemic. And 80% tried not to think about it at all, and 56% tried to pretend it wasn't happening. And then finally on this slide, 88% took their mind off the pandemic by focusing on other activities. So as we just saw, relationships were influenced by the pandemic, and they were also influential in reducing the impacts of the pandemic. So now I'm actually going to turn our attention to more deeply unpacking the relationship measures that we included in the survey. So we talked a little bit about, well, I should say Heather and Stuart talked a little bit about developmental relationships and developmental assets. But developmental relationships are close connections with adults, near peers and peers that help young people cultivate their abilities to shape their own lives, build resilience, and thrive. We know that these close connections are critically important for young people, especially those who have experienced challenging circumstances. In this survey, we asked students a series of questions about their relationships with others. And so overall, we had 5 different relationships that we looked at, which I'm going to unpack on the next slide. But generally, what we wanted to better understand is what are the access levels that young people have with developmental relationships? How many on average are students experiencing? And I think what we see here is fairly positive. The fact that over half of students have 3 or more developmental relationships. But then there's also, of course, a group that has access to 2 or less, and actually a quarter of students have 1 or no developmental relationship. So there's still some concern. I think generally the fact that most have 3 or more is definitely a positive takeaway, but the work is, of course, not done. So now unpacking each of the 5 that we looked at, you can see here at the bottom the names of the 5 groups, but parenting adults, teachers, friends, program leaders, and neighbors were the 5 that we assessed. And we know that relationships look different across individuals, and we know that individuals need different things from different people at different times. So assessing relationships can be challenging, but with this case, we wanted to really understand with the 5 elements that I'm going to go into on the next slide, where are those present within each of these? Where are they getting care? Where are they getting support, et cetera? So parenting adults were clearly a group that young people felt they have strong developmental relationships with. So an overwhelming majority, 80% of all young people surveyed felt that those relationships are strong. In second, the second highest and third highest here, fairly close, are teachers and friends at 62% and 61%. So still a good majority of young people feel that they have strong positive relationships with both of those groups. Just for definition purposes, when we asked about parenting adults, we did note that parents refers to the adults who care for you most of the time, and gave some examples that could also include foster parents, step parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, or guardians, and that this may be 1 or more people. So the 4th one here, program leaders, again, another definition there. We told young people that program leaders refers to the adults who lead activities you participate in. So examples could be coaches, mentors, club leaders, religious leaders, scout volunteers, and other adults who work in after-school programs. So we had this little bit of a lower percentage there. Just under half felt that they had developmental relationships with an adult that would fit under that umbrella. And then finally, we had neighbors, which came in as the lowest, but still present for some young people at 22%. And with that, we define neighbors for young people as other adults you know in your town, neighborhood, or close to where you live. So I'm going to unpack the elements across each of the relational targets, so you can get a sense of where are they getting different relationship elements from whom. So in terms of teachers, what we saw is that one of the most positive takeaways that they're getting in their relationships with teachers is the ability for the teachers to challenge them and challenge their growth specifically. And so that came in as the strongest here, looking across these 5 elements listed on the left. It may be alarming to see that express care is actually the lowest here in terms of the percent of students who experienced it often or almost always. But express care is somewhat nuanced and individualized, and teachers are often interacting with students in a setting where there's 20 or 30 other individuals in the room. So this one can be a challenging element to incorporate into classroom practice. So it really speaks to the need to find those small moments beyond the classroom to express care. And I think it's also important to note that with challenge growth, overall, that's a strength, and they're clearly getting that from these relationships with their teachers. But it's also important to pay attention to the gap between express care and challenge growth. When we have high levels of challenge without care, that may be viewed as a stressor for students. The second group here, parents, had a couple of strengths that I wanted to highlight, one being express care and the other being challenge growth. So both of those, we had nearly 90% of students say that they experience care and challenge from their parents often or almost always, which is overwhelmingly positive. Generally, looking across the 5 elements for parenting adults, most of these are quite strong. The third group here, their friends, is somewhat similar to parents, just less experiences in often and almost always. But the strength here for most young people was in express care. So they definitely saw their peers as a source for care. They also saw their peers as a source for most of these other elements, but express care bubbled to the top. Oops. And the fourth group here, program leads. So this one, similar to teachers, challenge growth was the strongest of the 5 elements, coming in at just shy of 70%. But generally, the experiences of program lead relationships were a little bit lower. Again, as we saw earlier, is around half or so. But when they did have those relationships, challenge growth was clearly a strength. And then finally, neighbors. So this group again was one of the lower or the lowest in terms of where they have access to developmental relationships. But when they did, they were a source of care. So what I just covered and shared was based on the responses from all young people. So again, that includes over 6,200 responses. And I think one of the benefits of having such a large group of young people participate is we're also able to look at how these experiences varied across different groups. And I just named a few things here that I thought would be important for us to highlight. One of them in particular is that relationships tended to become weaker as we progressed higher in grade levels. And this held true in all relational targets outside of friends, where we actually saw an increase. With teachers, we had a high of 87% of young people experiencing a developmental relationship with teachers in grades 4 and 5. However, by the time we're looking at high school students, that actually fell to just shy of 50%. So that's nearly a 40% gap between the late elementary school students and high school students in terms of how they view relationships with their teachers. Generally, we had gaps in neighbors, parenting adults, and program leaders, but it was much smaller at 10 to 20 percentage points in each. We also had some differences across race and ethnicity. Most were within 10 percentage points outside of one group, which was our Asian students. And they, on average, experienced higher levels of developmental relationships across all targets. And I named a few here that were the biggest gap: teachers, friends, and program leaders. We also saw 2 other groups, the students who expressed experiencing the most financial strain were less likely to experience developmental relationships than their peers in all relational targets, except for teachers, in which there was very little difference. And then finally, our LGBT students, again, limited to high school only, experienced a significant difference in their relationships with parenting adults compared to their peers. While the other relational targets were slightly lower for this group, their relationships with parents was by far the largest gap. So one of the other measures that we included on the survey was a way for us to assess how do young people feel about their school's commitment to inclusion. So this measure asked students to reflect on whether or not they felt the school was inclusive of all students. And to do so, that included some questions about fairness, if they're able to get to know others who may be different from them, seeing adults in the space who look like them, celebrating other cultures or learning about other cultures. And generally, yes, students were pretty positive here about the school's commitment to inclusion. So any score above a 50 here is a good score. About 2/3 of students, so if we break that down into 4 different quartiles here, just to get a sense of the percent of students who have very strong experiences, good experiences to somewhat weaker experiences, about 2/3 of students have a good or great experience in feeling included in school. And about 1/3 feel that this is a growth area, with 11% feeling that it could use some much more work. Generally, when we unpack this based on some of the same subgroups that I mentioned on the previous slide around relationships, students were more likely to perceive less inclusion if they identified as another gender, if they were African American, if they were financially strained, or if they were gay or lesbian. We also saw that this progressed down as we moved into those older grade levels as well, so grades 10 through 12 specifically. And I should note also on here that even with those gender differences and race differences and financial strain differences, et cetera, most of those still landed just at 50 or right above 50, which are still good scores. So I also want to talk a bit about experiences of bias or discrimination. So again, this was limited to high school students. And what we wanted to understand is generally, have they experienced any time where they felt they had perceived bias or discrimination against them? And if so, was it more so from their peers, adults, or from both? And so of our high school student sample, which at the bottom there I have noted as 2,900 students, 41% of those students stated that they did experience some form of bias or discrimination.
Justin, I hate to interrupt you really quick, but just to clarify this section, this is bias and discrimination in our community, correct? As
Correct.
opposed to, yeah, so this would be youth in general, bias and discrimination in Bartholomew County.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. So the commitment to inclusion slide was focused on school. This is now broadly applied to any context that these young people find themselves within. So yeah, so it was adults and peers were the language that we used when posing these questions. So of the 41% of students who said, I should say of teens who experienced bias or discrimination, 47% felt that it actually came from both adults in their life or from peers. When we also had, they could select both. So that's why that's 47%. 35% of students said that it only came from peers, and 18% said it only came from adults. When we unpacked this further, for those who said they did experience it in some form, we wanted to better understand what was it that they felt led to that experience. So they could select more than one of these, so these won't add up to 100%. But students generally felt that gender and age were the biggest contributors to these experiences. We also asked students in those experiences, how did that play out? What happened? And for the most part, there were two that kind of came out as being the most likely ways that the experience played out. So the first was they felt they were treated with less respect. And the second was that these individuals made false assumptions about them. And again, they could select as many of these that were applicable to their situation. So these won't add up to 100%. So in addition to bias and discrimination, we knew it was going to be important to better understand some of the adverse childhood experiences that these young people may have had throughout their childhood. So we asked a series of 12 questions, again, limited to teens. So those students in grades 9 through 12 about different ACEs or experiences. And what we found is that 41% of teens, and I'm just going to actually caveat here that the percentages here are limited to the students who provided a response to each of the 12. So that sample size at the top right that I have, 1,268 students in high school responded to this section in full. So 41% of those students or those teens lived with someone at some point who was mentally ill, suicidal, and or severely depressed. And on the right-hand side, I just wanted to note and call attention to the fact that the red percentages here are the average experience, but it looked a bit different depending on the young person's own background. So for some, there are a couple, for some, there are a few. With this one in particular, girls were 5 percentage points more likely. So 46% of girls lived with someone who was mentally ill. Financial strain and LGBT status were also much more represented within this ACE. So 29% and 28%. And then with the second one here, 33% of teens lived with someone who had a problem with alcohol or drugs. And again, this was experienced more commonly by students who also stated that they had financial strain or were part of the LGBT community. 16% of teens had a parenting adult who served time in jail or prison at some point during their life. And this was slightly higher for, again, a few groups. Our Black students, it came in at 30% in total, financially strained, 28% higher, and LGBT, 26%. With the last one here, teens, whether or not they had a parenting adult who either separated or divorced during their lifetime. And again, we saw similar groups as the one prior have more representation or more experiences with this ACE. So the second set here, 16% of teens have parenting adults who physically hurt each other in front of them at least once. 50% of teens felt that no one in their family loved them on at least one occasion. 41% of teens felt that their family did not feel close to each other on at least one occasion. And 10% of teens were a victim of violence in their neighborhood. Now, we're starting to see some trends here where we see a bit higher representation. In some of these, for example, the second one here, girls were more likely than boys or others to experience a feeling that their family did not love them on more than one occasion. And same was true for girls in their families not feeling close. So 7% more and 5% more respectively. And then with the last one here, victim of violence, our Black students felt that that was a more common experience for them at 21%. The final set of ACEs here, 25% of teens stated that they witnessed violence in their neighborhood on at least one occasion. And looking at some of these subgroups, again, we had more Black students say that's true for them at 40%, financially strained, more likely at 49%, and LGBT status, 41% in total. And 31% of teens felt that no one was there to protect them on at least one occasion. 12% of teens did not have clean clothing or enough food on at least one occasion. And 12% of teens felt that a parent was either too drunk or high to take care of them on at least one occasion. So we know that these experiences happened. We know that there are, for some of these ACEs, significant percentages of young people who stated that they felt that way or saw that or experienced it. We also looked at ACEs in terms of how many ACEs on average did teens experience. And it was generally between 2 to 3 ACEs on average. So any average teen selected just above 2 of those ACEs, those 12 ACEs that we had listed. A third of our teens stated that they had no ACEs. And this varied a bit by gender. We saw girls slightly closer to 3 ACEs compared to boys who were less likely to have ACEs and coming in right around 2. With non-binary students, so students who opted to self-report their gender, this jumped to over 4 ACEs. And this experience did not vary significantly across race ethnicity, except for the teens who selected more than one race. So our multiracial students experienced 3 ACEs on average compared to around 2 for all other racial or ethnic groups. And high financial strain was typically the strongest predictor of ACE experience. High financial strain typically reflected having 7 ACEs or nearly 7 ACEs compared to less than 2 for those students who had low financial strain. And then finally, our straight students experienced 2 ACEs on average. When we looked at students who identified as LGBT, this increased to just over 4 ACEs. So now I want to turn our attention to some of the positive outcomes that we looked at in the survey. So we know that relationships serve as promotional factors or levers through which we promote these developmental outcomes. But we also know that traumatic experiences such as the ACEs I covered, such as the bias and discrimination we talked about, we also know that those can serve as barriers to growth as well. So it's important that we covered both some of those levers as well as some of those barriers to put the positive outcomes that we're looking at into context. So our social emotional competence measure looked at students' report of their own self-perceptions, of their own self-awareness, as well as their social awareness, responsible decision-making, self-management, and relationship skills. And generally, some of the growth areas appear to be relationship skills and self-management, but strong scores were represented in both social and self-awareness and responsible decision-making. Generally, when looking at social emotional competence here, again, a score above 50 is a good score, and we're looking at a score of 68. So students generally felt, and these questions were posed to grades 4 through 12, all grade levels who participated, but students generally felt very positive about their own social emotional competence overall. When we unpack that a little bit, the distribution bar that you see at the top there, about 2% felt that they really don't see themselves as having any social emotional competence, 16% with a little bit, but certainly a growth area. We also unpacked this a little bit based on some of the subgroups that I've been discussing. Generally, what we found is that those students who experienced high financial strain were less likely to have social emotional competence than their peers. And this is also one area where it wasn't significantly different between our younger and older populations. And in some cases, it actually saw improvement as we moved up in grade levels as well. Our second outcome area that we looked at is academic motivation. And with this outcome, we were asking students really just their perceptions of their own motivation in school and to be lifelong learners. Generally, again, similar result, 67 out of 100. That's a very positive score, firmly in that meets goal, light purple range there. Of course, as we break it down into the distribution of experiences, about 6% of our students felt that they're disengaged from school. 16% felt that they're somewhat disengaged, and it's definitely a growth area. So there's still some students who are experiencing low levels of academic motivation. And this is also true across different subgroups as well. So our girl students were more likely to have higher academic motivation than their peers who identified as boys or self-described. Our African-American students were less likely to have academic motivation. Our financially strained students, again, experiencing lower levels of academic motivation, and our bisexual students as well. This is also an area where, as we moved into the grades 10 through 12, or the later years in high school, we saw this fall. Now, however, putting this in context of a good score, again, all of these averages are still above the threshold of 50. So they're all still generally on average a good score, just slightly lower than what we saw in the overall aggregate. A third outcome area that we looked at was academic self-efficacy. And with this set of questions, we asked students about their own beliefs and their abilities to do well in school. And students were generally positive, including more positive than the prior two outcomes here. So some of the questions that we asked is whether or not they feel that they're capable of learning what is being taught to them, if they're confident that they can figure out their most difficult schoolwork. That question in particular was a little bit lower than the others, but generally still a positive outcome. So with a score of 69 out of 100 here, we're in the high level of that light purple range. And again, only 16% of students felt that they don't believe in their own abilities when it comes to their schoolwork or education. Again, we did see some differences across similar subgroups that we saw in the prior two outcome areas. If they identified as another gender beyond boy or girl, we saw a little bit of a drop. Our Black or African-American students perceived lower academic self-efficacy than their peers. Financially strained students and LGBT plus status also perceived lower self-efficacy than their peers. And this also went up as we progressed in grade levels as well. So now I want to turn our attention to really one of the core measures that we included in the survey around developmental assets. So as we heard from Heather, this measure was included back in 2018 and again in 2022. So it's an identical measure, which gives us the ability to really look at how the results differ now after having been through a global pandemic compared to what we saw back in 2018. So I do think that now that we've talked about relationships and experiences and some outcomes, it really dovetails well into what the developmental assets framework is. Developmental assets are really the building blocks of positive youth development. So these are the external factors and internal strengths that the research suggests young people need in order to grow into healthy adults and contribute to society. I wanted to note a couple of demographic differences here and just contextualize what the data is going to look like going forward. So in 2018, we focused specifically on our middle school and high school students. in last year's survey, we included grades 4 and 5. So that's a population that was not represented in the initial survey. So for the purposes of the aggregate data that I'm going to share, I've removed grade 4 and 5 so that we can make those comparisons, but I'll also just note areas where we saw some strengths within that late elementary school group. I also wanted to note a couple of differences within gender and race ethnicity. So looking at gender, this is the first time where we included an option for students to self-report on their gender. So what we found is that 11% of students either elected to use that field or they elected to leave that question blank. So we have lower representation in our female and male students. However, it is still fairly even across those two genders. Looking at race ethnicity, a couple of notable differences in the data. One would be that in 2018, 72% of the participants stated that they were white, whereas in this 2022 survey, only 61% selected white. Where we saw an increase was in multiracial. We had 12% of students in 2022 compared to 7% in 2018 who identified as multiple races. So those were some of the differences that we saw in terms of the demographics, but generally, when we're looking at the data going forward, it's going to focus on grades 6 through 12. So looking at the data points on this slide, so these are the overall averages. So on the left, top left there, we have a total asset score on a range from 0 to 60, 38.8 out of 60, which puts us in that orange range, which is vulnerable. And really what we mean by vulnerable is that there's certainly room for growth in either their internal or external assets. With 38.8, it's in the somewhat higher end of vulnerable, approaching adequate. We broke that down into two different areas: the external assets, which focus more on what they're getting from the people and environments around them, and the internal assets that focus more on their internal strengths or social emotional competencies. And generally what we saw here is that there were some differences in experiences across some of our students. In particular, we found that our late elementary through early middle school students, so grades 4 through 7, tended to have greater access to developmental assets than their peers who are in grades 8 through 12. We also saw that our Asian students expressed stronger asset experiences than their peers generally across the board. It was about +6 points. We also saw that some of our students are Black, Hispanic, or Latino, and multiracial students had some divergent experiences from the average, about -2. And compared to 2018 data, generally we saw a 2-point drop in our overall average result. This was felt fairly evenly across both external and internal assets, but impacted our girl students far more than it did our boy students. So our boy students tended to look more similar to their 2018 data than our girl students did. So we know that averages, of course, can mask the overall experience of the students. So this pie chart here is intended to convey that not every student had a 38 on average asset score, which would put them in the orange range. But we still had about 41% of students that had good or great levels of assets, which are represented in those purple and green areas there. Generally, most students, 42% of them, were in that vulnerable range, but again, experiences differed greatly. So on the opposite end of things, we had 17% of students state that they really aren't receiving any assets across different contexts, which include their families, school, in the community. When we looked at these trends based on different subgroups, we saw pretty similar results to what I highlighted on the previous slide with the average scores, with girls typically having higher levels of assets compared to boys, but still, yet again, having the most decreases compared to their 2018 data. Looking at the overall difference between 2022 and 2018, we saw a 7 percentage point drop in the thriving, which is the green bar there. And we saw a 7 percentage point increase in that orange grouping, the vulnerable range of assets there. So within developmental assets, we're looking at 8 different categories, which you can see listed on the left here. The top 4 areas are the external assets. And so again, these are focused on what we as the people who surround young people, what are we providing to them within these spaces? And the bottom 4 here are the internal assets. So what are young people seeing in themselves related to commitment to learning, for example? Now we can see just based on the colors here that there are clearly some that are viewed as much stronger or more accessible to students than others. And predominantly, we see those in the external assets. So support, empowerment, and boundaries and expectations, all within that adequate range, which suggests that young people feel, on average, fairly positive about receiving those 3 things across contexts. Additionally, within the internal assets, they feel pretty positive about their own social competencies. Now, there are 4 other categories that fall within the vulnerable range, with 3 of them within internal assets. So commitment to learning, positive values, and positive identity. Those 3 were all slightly lower, but still approaching the high end of the vulnerable range. The 4th one here, constructive use of time, falls within external assets, but is somewhat unique in the way that it's assessed. So really, we're asking young people about the time they spend in experiences outside of school. This is one where, as we move into an action planning stage, I think it's critical to look at the item level detail. Where are they spending their time? And is that an activity that's of a high quality nature? But generally here, I think the external assets can be viewed as somewhat positive overall, even outside of constructive use of time, which we know is a bit more complicated than internal assets. So when we looked across different subgroups, we saw some pretty notable things in most areas, including race, grade level, and gender. So for example, boys were less likely to express having constructive use of time and commitment to learning, and girls were less likely to experience positive identity. When we looked at grade level, grades 4 through 7 tended to have greater access to most of the external assets compared to their peers who were in late middle school or high school. We also found that commitment to learning was an area where elementary school students, those in grades 4 and 5, were far more likely to express having higher levels of that. From a race ethnicity perspective, as I mentioned before, our Asian students expressed having stronger asset levels in most of these areas on average. When we posed the questions to Black, Hispanic, or multiracial students, they felt that they had less experiences of constructive use of time. And Black students also felt that they had fewer assets in commitment to learning, positive values, and social competencies. Compared to 2018, where we saw the most notable drop was in constructive use of time, and that was about 2 points lower than what we saw then. We also saw slightly smaller drops in all of the other asset categories, but constructive use of time was definitely the one that had the most significant drop. Now, again, with averages, we tend to mask the distribution. So I just wanted to note here that these experiences varied depending on the young person we're asking. Generally, we want to see more green, and we want to see more purple. The two areas that really stick out to me as having a lot of red or orange are constructive use of time. 78% of our students, so just over 3/4 of our students, feel that they don't really have a space outside of school that's productive. And the second one here, positive identity, about 2/3 of students, 66% of our students, felt that their own perceptions of their identity are low. And within positive identity, we asked questions about self-esteem. We asked questions about their autonomy or agency. We asked questions about their own positive view of their personal future. Again, this is an area where out of all of the 8 asset categories, this was the one where girls also responded more negatively than boys did as well. The final bit I wanted to talk about here is that it takes a village to develop these assets in young people. There are multiple sectors involved. We know that it's a community-based effort. We know that we're only successful when this goes beyond home, beyond the school, and really broaches the community. So we want to unpack, where are young people getting more of their assets? So generally what we see here, on the left, you'll see the 5 contexts that we look at, but generally students felt that their families are providing most of their asset experiences, followed by schools. Beyond those 2 groups, we had their peers or their social networks, and then we had their own contributions to themselves. So again, kind of going back to that positive identity. And then finally, we had the community, where they felt they were actually receiving the fewest assets from the general community. And when we unpack these a bit more by those same subgroups, we found that boys were less likely to experience assets from the community context than the average. We also found that grades 4 and 6 were more likely to experience asset-rich environments, both at home with their family as well as in the school. Black and multiracial students had less asset experiences in their school with their peers and in the community. And Latino students were similar as well with the community level experiences. Compared to 2018, we saw nearly a 2-point drop in the community context. All other areas saw some level of a decrease, but it was less than 1 point. So the community and where young people feel they're receiving assets in the community did differ quite a bit compared to 2018. I think it's also notable that even though each of these contexts had a drop, with community having the largest, the school context had the lowest decrease out of any of the 5. And again, that was the average experience. We know there's young people who are experiencing challenged levels, which means very few assets in each of these areas. So I want to acknowledge that the average experience is not applicable to everyone. So again, green and purple are where we want our young people to feel that they're getting assets in each of these 5 contexts. Generally, probably to no surprise based on the averages, we see higher levels of red and orange, both in community and when they're referring to their own personal contributions to their assets. So that is a summary of all of the data we collected. I don't know if do we have time for?
Sure, we sure do. So we have a couple questions. We have several good questions in the chat, but we have time for just a few. So the first question is, were biracial students included in the multicultural percentage or another percentage?
They were included in the multiple races. So I'm going to just go back to that slide so you can see what I'm talking about here. So multiracial was not actually an option on the survey. They were able to select more than one race. And if they did, then they were factored in as multiracial.
Okay, the next question was, how did the survey determine whether a youth had a strong developmental relationship with a particular person, for example, a teacher or parent? Was this based on their answers to several questions about the 5 elements?
Yes, great question. So yes, that is exactly correct. We asked several questions about each of the 5 elements that are listed here. So express care, challenge growth, provide support, share power, and expand possibilities, all had questions posed. And those questions were posed for each of the 5 relational targets that we see on this slide here. So what we did was calculate on this slide, this is basically just presenting the frequencies where they responded. So if they selected a response option of often or almost always, et cetera. But we used a scoring process to determine whether or not they reached a threshold to meet our definition of a developmental relationship. So they had to experience all of these at least often in order for a DR to be a developmental relationship to be present and then be on this slide.
Okay. And then looking back at the constructive use of time.
Yep.
Can you share what the options were that were given for that category? Like what activities were included?
Yeah, so there were 4 questions and I may forget one, so bear with me, but one was about time at home. So constructive use of time at home with their family. So essentially time not spent simply alone at home. Another was focused on out of school time or after school settings. Another was focused on in-school activities, clubs or sports, I believe. And the final one was focused on more spiritual settings, so whether they attended activities at a religious setting like a church, for example, or a mosque or synagogue.
So employment or after school job was not included, correct?
Correct.
Those are all the questions we have time for. We have to move on to our next steps. So just a reminder, I know Brittany dropped it in the chat, but any questions that were submitted that we didn't get to will be shared in an FAQ document that you will receive through your registered email, the email you use to register for tonight's presentation. You can also use the QR code and drop your questions there. We'll be accepting questions through March 17th. And then we will send that out via email and also post it on our website. So next steps, what do we do? So before we get into that piece, I'd just like to thank Justin so much for his thorough explanation of all of this data. We greatly appreciate how thorough the Search Institute has been in helping us share this data with the community. Also to Dr. Hart and Heather, as well as BCSC and Flat Rock Hall Creek leadership for really being willing to take this on and give us youth voice in Bartholomew County. So from CYD's perspective, we will do what we have been doing, and that is to continue offering quality free community workshops. One of those is understanding ACEs. An important part of the data you just received was around adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. If you want to learn more about how ACEs impact brain development, as well as how youth might overcome ACEs events, we suggest that you register for the March 8th training here at the Columbus Learning Center, and there's a QR code there. You can also register on our website. Research also shows us that young people are more likely to grow up successfully when they experience developmental relationships. And they need to do that with many important people in their lives. So if you'd like to learn more about developmental relationships, we also have another free workshop coming up at the Learning Center on April 26th. You can register for that on our website or using the QR code in the presentation. CYD has also partnered with Sukasa to offer mental health first aid training to both teens and teen caregivers. That could be parents, that could be youth care workers, that could be guardians. And those sessions are all free, and they are also being offered in Spanish and English. The next one being offered is for caregivers. That will be offered in English on Wednesday, April 13th at the Columbus Learning Center. Registration is required for that event. You can use that link as well as the QR code. A copy of this presentation or a copy of the recording will be uploaded to our website tomorrow. You will also receive a link to that in your email along with the FAQ document when we've had some time to compile the answers to all of your questions. So for more information about any of the topics that we've just discussed with you pertaining to youth development, we encourage you to subscribe to the CYD monthly newsletter, as well as visit our website. CYD and local area partners work together to share upcoming webinars, workshops, and events on our website, www.cydbartholomew.org. Thank you again for attending tonight's presentation. We look forward to having you work with us to find positive solutions to issues facing our young people. Good night.